test out your business models, your value proposition, your pricing proposition, and your willingness to pay very, very early on and often.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the connected relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Daniel Elizalde. Here are 3 things you want to know about Daniel before we start. He is the IoT instructor at Stanford University. Wow. He's VP and Head of IoT for North America at Ericsson, and he's been an IoT product management coach for many years. And I am so fascinated to have Daniel on. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Mark, for such a nice introduction. I hope I live up to it.
I've heard you speak before. I think you're going to.
It's an honor being here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Hey, let's start with the easy question. How'd you get into this IoT stuff?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. And honestly, I've been doing connected products for over 20 years. When I started my career, I was at a company called National Instruments that was instrumentation for manufacturing. So really adding sensors to data acquisition systems, acquiring data, concentrating them, and storing it in a server and providing reports and insights out of that. And it turns out that that was 20 years ago, but that's what we call IoT today. And because of how my career has progressed, I always have pursued these types of companies and roles that have to do with hardware and software, acquiring data from the real world, and has evolved into having a name today. You know, it evolved from being telemetry and M2M, then IoT. And so now I have IoT in my title, but that's what I've been doing for all my career.
Yeah, what I find fascinating is you are probably the most expert person in IoT. Maybe I'll say the most visible expert person in IoT, because almost every article I run into that says IoT, you wrote it.
Thank you. I can't take that credit. There's a lot of experts out there, and I just made really part of my mission to articulate the lessons learned and trying to do that. And, you know, with Ericsson as well, we have a part of my role is to be that area of thought leadership for Ericsson in IoT. So, you know, I've been very vocal about these topics for many, many years with my podcast and my blog and my classes. And it's just something that I'm very passionate about, demystifying what it is and focusing on value. And that's one of the reasons I was very excited to come to your podcast, because it's not about the gadgets, it's not about the technology, it's about value.
Well, what a great lead in to the next topic I want to bring up. And I want people, if you're not familiar with IoT and you've never built an IoT product, I just want you to understand how complicated this thing really is. So Daniel's put out his article, a paper that says 12 steps to profitable IoT products. And if you were to look through that, 1 through 5, steps 1 through 5 are typical product management tasks, things that we would all do if we were product managers. Step 6 is about data strategy, and I hope you and I get a chance to talk a lot about step 6 today, Daniel. Step 7 is business model, which is what fascinates me. And then 8 through 12 are these technical implementation issues, like the IoT technology stack. Daniel, can you just briefly tell us what those are so that people who aren't familiar with this are in awe of what you do and what these companies that do IoT have to do?
That's one of the first things that I start in my classes, and when I talk to my teams and I coach executives and all that, is starting with the building blocks. And in my view of the world, every IoT product has this 5 layers of the IoT technology stack. So you have the devices themselves, the hardware with the sensors and the computing. Then you have embedded software. Then you have some sort of connectivity. In the case of the expertise we have at Ericsson, of course, it's going to be cellular IoT. And then you have some kind of cloud aggregation component, and then you have applications on top of that. And so it doesn't matter whether you are building something for smart homes or, you know, security for buildings or manufacturing or autonomous vehicles, they all are sharing that same technology stack. Therefore, each one of those layers of the technology stack, it's its own product in its own right. So the challenge with IoT is that to provide a end-to-end IoT solution, you have to put all those things together with the technical complexity that entails, But of course, with the pricing complexity and the business model complexity and the go-to-market complexity, et cetera. So it's the same type of product management challenge that we've been experiencing for years. It's just exponentially more complex because the amount of components that you have to deal with.
And so imagine that you're a software company and you have to do great product management for your software product. That's hard. And then you say you're a hardware company, but of course your hardware runs software. Now you're doing two of those things. And what we just heard Daniel describe is I've got 5 of these layers I have to deal with, not just 1 or 2. That's insane.
Yeah, and then there's some additional complexities from, for a process perspective that I like to discuss, which is security, right? Security is a big thing. So now you have to deal with security at each layer of the stack. And then regulations, right? When you're dealing with, especially the types of products that I work with, industrial products, critical infrastructure, there's a lot of regulatory aspects to your products across the whole stack. So again, complexity starts building up, and that's why they're so complex.
So all I could say is it had better be worth it.
And that is exactly what we are dealing with in the industry. I think that companies are starting to figure out that this is so complex that you can't just put something together and launch it to market and hope it sticks, because you have to do your homework from a product management perspective. And yes, the tools and the technology has made it a lot easier today than it would have been 20 years ago. But still, it's a big undertaking. So it better be worth it, right? And I think that's the value of product management and IoT strategy is hopefully you can be 2-3 steps ahead and have some inkling that it will be worth it before you commit to building something like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do business models first. And if we have a chance, we'll come back and chat a little bit about data. Do you have a nice way to summarize business models? I looked at a bunch of them and tried to summarize them myself, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
For sure. So I like to go back to the definition of what is, a business model, right? A business model, as you know, is just a way of deliver and collect value from your customers. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can think about how could you do that. And what is very interesting about IoT is that it opens the door for new business models and innovation for companies. And yes, that could be a typical heading from a blog post, right? That we've heard that a lot. But what does that really mean? The way I see it is that if you think about how, let's say, hardware companies in the past, they would develop a product and they would ship it to their customer and they never heard from them again, right? Other than support. IoT, what enables us to do is to have a 24/7 connection to that customer because we are adding sensors and we're monitoring the behavior of that product in the field. And so if you're able to monitor your product 24/7 in the field, how can you actually leverage that to provide new and innovative ways of monetizing and adding value? So subscription programs or subscription models is one of the key ones that we see a lot, and we can talk a lot more about what that means in IoT. But it's a way of saying, well, instead of having a Capex expenditure, well, actually, let's take a step back and understand what the customer is really trying to solve. They're not looking to buy equipment, they're looking to solve a problem. So maybe you can sell them a subscription to solve that problem that just happens to have hardware attached to it, right? So it opens all these possibilities. Now, the challenge is, which one is the right for your company, for your customer, and can you actually pull it off as a company, right? So we can talk a lot about examples of business models, but I think it's interesting to know that not because IoT enables them, it means that it's right for your customer and that actually your company can pull it off.
Yeah, I think the subscription model is pretty amazing for IoT. I think of software companies, and I've dealt with tons of them, where they had on-prem or perpetual license solutions. They said, hey, I want to go to a subscription. And they just took the total 3-year cost of ownership, divided it by 36, and said, we're going to charge you this much per month. And now it's a subscription instead of a perpetual license. And what they didn't do was think through the continual delivery of value to the customer, right? Because the subscription, it should be different than a perpetual license product. Do you see that in IoT as one of the stumbling blocks?
I do. I see that a lot, and I'm really glad you're pointing it out because the way you describe it is not necessarily a subscription, it's just a payment plan, right?
Exactly.
the idea is, if it is a subscription per se, how can you make sure that you continue to add value to your customer? So there's a couple of things that we can discuss. Like one of them is traditional software companies that go to as a service model, they don't have the hardware component that is associated with IoT. And what that means is that there's always a Capex expenditure that somebody has to pay for, right? Doesn't mean that you're going to charge your customer for it. You could, but doesn't have to be. But that doesn't mean that that cost doesn't exist. So yes, you can have this subscription, but then you got to make sure that either your customer pays for some of that hardware cost up front to make it viable, or that the longevity of the minimum contract is such that you can actually amortize that cost. So those are the kind of things when you think about subscription with IoT, companies don't necessarily think about the physical aspect of things, also require operation, require maintenance. And so how do you bake into that plan? If it's just the operation, like if you were doing software, that's one thing. But when you have these physical things, how do you bake all those things? Installation, right? I used to work at a company doing energy storage solutions. And, an installation of one of those systems would be $300,000, $500,000, just the installation, right? And so how do you actually break all the different components of the solution in terms of price and value, and also the different elements of the life cycle, right? Installation, provisioning, operation, maintenance. How does that all play into, right? So that's why we're talking about different types of approaches, right?
Yes. So let's talk through the hardware piece. First off, when I think about software, oftentimes they have implementation. So if you've got a big implementation, you're going to charge your customer for implementation services. And that's hundreds of thousands of dollars typically if you're going to do that. And usually you get that up front. In hardware, you've always got this physical cost, right? You've got a real life cost you've got to pay for the product. And even if there wasn't implementation, how do you coach companies to think about, do I want to charge for that up front? Do I want to bundle it into the monthly subscription payment? I often think of my cable company, or actually I use Dish Network, and I have a dish box. And so I didn't pay them for it, but I pay them monthly for it.
Correct. Yeah, and the reality here is that the way I coach companies and even my teams, right? Because as head of IoT here at Ericsson, I run the D15 IoT studio, and we run an innovation hub doing these kinds of solutions, right? So I'm in it every day. Some of the discussions that I have with my teams and other companies has to do with understanding what is going to reduce the friction on your customer side, because it's all about adoption, right? And so there is no one size fits all. The approach I like to take is business model experimentation. And so by understanding how the different pieces, like which are the different pieces, right? Like the stack and the life cycle, and then the different levers that you can pull, subscription for the software, payment for the hardware upfront, payment of the hardware deferred, hardware is free, but you charge a big maintenance fee, right? So you can play with all those things to figure out, and I've done a lot of spreadsheets that I use as templates to figure out, okay, let's move all these levers and figure out when my return is positive. And then you got to go out and test them, because if your spreadsheet says this is possible, that's good for your company, but that doesn't mean that that's a frictionless approach for your customer. They might say, no, we actually have more Capex budget than OpEx budget, so we actually want to do it this way. So one of the challenges when defining value for IoT is having a clear understanding of who your customer is, what industry vertical they're in, and how do they buy, because then the experimentation has to do with how do we reduce that friction. And so the role of a product management team here is to figure out understanding the complexities of IoT and then being able to model different approaches and test them with your customer, right? That's the key. There's no one size fits all.
Yes, what I love about that is that's what all companies should be doing, is going out and listening to their customers and how do they want to buy, and see if we could sell it in a way that they want to buy it.
Yeah, and it's I made a joke to my teams the other day. It's like, it's 2020 and we've had agile and lean startup and all these different philosophies for a while now, and the majority of companies are still technology first and putting something together and see if it sticks, right? And so it's interesting. The tools are out there, but it's just very contrary to what typical business as usual is, right? Because here, when you're talking about IoT, whether we like it or not, whether you're a startup or whether you are a established company, the technology and the area of IoT, it's emerging technology, it's emerging business, it's innovation. So you have to treat it with that experimentation and iterative approach as opposed to business as usual, right? So that's where I see a lot of companies, especially bigger companies, stumble because they are not used to that. And they think, well, we're a mature company. This is just some new tech. We're just going to run with it. And it's very different. So it's a switch in mentality. And you have to start thinking a little bit more like a startup in the sense of you got to try things because it's also going to be new to your customer, right? So you're fighting the incumbency of whatever they have today that you're trying to displace.
Our goal at Impact Pricing is to help you become a champion of pricing and value. This will undoubtedly increase your impact at your company. It'll help you get promoted and make your company more profitable. And now we have an unbelievable offer to push you even further down that path. We just released our new Insider program where you get access to all of our current and future courses. If you just take the courses we currently have released, that's over $2,000 in value. The good news is we release courses at a rate faster than one every 2 months. That's faster than anybody's been able to take them, at least so far. You get access to everything for the low price of just $100 per month. That's a small portion of the raise that may come with your next promotion. To make this offer even more irresistible, we offer you your first month for only $5. Try a few courses, see what you learn that's valuable. We are confident you're going to want to stick around. Oh, and did I mention you get access to office hours? 1 hour a week, I get on Zoom and answer questions from our insiders. Considering I charge $1,000 for 1 hour pricing consultation, that makes this a no-brainer. Go to insider.championsofvalue.com to sign up. To take advantage of our special $5 offer, use the promo code INSIDERNOW. This special offer will end at the end of April 2020. Join me and your colleagues as a champion of value insider. I'll see you on the inside. Another thing I see in, let's say, big companies especially, but hardware companies in particular, is if a hardware company, they decide they want to sell software, they want to sell services along the side, I find that they have a really hard time selling the software because they've gotten themselves so locked into a cost plus mentality on the hardware products. Do you see that as a problem in the IoT as they're shifting towards IoT as well?
It is. It is a big problem I see. And that's why I believe IoT as a quote unquote discipline is important to understand end to end, because hardware companies, as you mentioned, have now to struggle with building, delivering, and selling software. But the same is true on the other side. Software companies have to now figure out how to build, partner, purchase, deliver, sell hardware. And that is a completely different ballgame, as you know. So here, I think the interesting thing is that no single company can own it all. So IoT forces us or invites us, I would say, to a more partnership-oriented go-to-market approach, because you have to partner with the companies that know how to build hardware, deploy, sell, with the companies that know how to do software at scale, on the cloud, at the edge, on the connectivity part, so that you can have a cohesive whole, taking the best of all worlds. And that's what we do again at the IoT Studio, because Ericsson focuses on connectivity. I mean, we're experts on the cellular part. Well, when we are working on a IoT solution, well, who is the best in class device vendor for this particular application, and embedded vendor and cloud provider, and we'll provide the connectivity, and you put things together in that way. And then you have to figure out the go-to-market of that, right? And of course, the pricing of such a complex solution with so many players, right? So I think that in the past 10 years, we've learned that first, nobody can do it on their own, right? No single company can do it all. And then vendors are trying to say, okay, well, I'm a software company. and I will just buy the other pieces from the rest of the stack and put them together myself, hasn't been successful either. So now we're starting to see a multi-company approach, and that's the latest iteration. We'll see where it takes us, right?
And so I assume that it's usually one company taking the lead to put all the pieces together. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. That's what I've seen the most. And I think the interesting part is from a customer perspective, they need to understand who are they buying from per se, right? When you talk about a big enterprise company that, it's an established company and just has a problem to solve, they're not going to care about technology building blocks. They want one company that provides a product and service, right? And that's important, product and service, to solve their problem. And so, yes, there needs to be a group of companies that are aligned to provide the solution, but the end customer does not want to deal with a piecemeal approach and having to deal with, okay, I buy the hardware from you, and I buy this from you, and I buy the integration from you and the maintenance from you, because they're saying, you know what, you guys are not ready for prime time. And that's one of the challenges we're seeing of why these solutions are not scaling. From a technology perspective, yeah, they can do the work, but when you start talking about scaling, millions of devices worldwide, the approach starts to crumble. Right. So does that resonate? Have you seen similar?
Absolutely. That resonates completely with me. And that if you think about what a buyer actually wants, they want a solution to their problem.
Correct.
And so they don't want to have to piece it all together.
And why it's interesting that I found is that part of the business model mindset shift has to do with product companies now starting to offer services, because what the buyer might want is a service, right? For example, if their manufacturing equipment is breaking down, they don't want a dashboard that tells them that it's about to break down with predictive maintenance and IoT, right? It's like, I want this fixed. And so it is possible that the company ends up selling a service to provide predictive maintenance on those machines, and the technology that they are using to figure out when equipment is service is an IoT / edge / AI type solution. But ultimately what the customer is paying for is a service of like professional services of maintenance backed by a tool. And so that is a big mental shift of like what customers really want versus what companies are willing to provide today.
Yeah. And let me offer that it's actually a step further than that as well. I don't think customers want to buy maintenance. They want to buy uptime.
Very good. Yes. I love that. That's true, right? Because they really don't care about the maintenance. And that's why I think that a lot of the challenge of understanding the customers is understanding the problem in depth. And the problem is, like you just mentioned, right? It's not maintenance. The problem is that they might be losing money because of uptime challenges. And that's, I think, where, when I was thinking about our conversation today, pricing challenges, a lot of things have to do with how do you provide enough value that makes sense for the customer to adopt your solution. Because yes, you can provide a very complex IoT solution and service to provide enhanced uptime, or the customer can just buy a redundant pump and that gives them the uptime, and that's that, right? So sometimes figuring out that your competition might be not other types of similar solutions, but just what are the other alternatives that the customer can realistically do for less money, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, they don't care about an IoT solution, they care about uptime. And if they just buy another pump, it's problem solved, right?
I don't think anybody cares about an IoT solution.
Agreed. Yeah, and it's interesting because, coming from the guy with IoT in his title, but it's true, right? Really, we have to focus on solving problems. And, sometimes when I've been, talking to other executives or coaching companies, et cetera, I'd be the first one to say, you know what, you really don't need IoT for this. Like if you do this other thing, right, just hire 3 more people to look after your equipment and you'll be fine. And it's cheaper, right? So
yes.
It's important for us to be humble in that perspective that, first of all, IoT is not a silver bullet. And if we continue to think about that and lead with the technology and IoT, we're really not focusing on solving the customer's problems. And then we can't complain that we're not gaining adoption, right?
Yeah. So IoT is just a tool. It's not the product or the solution, or it's just a tool.
It's a capability that can help companies provide a better, faster, cheaper solution to their customers, whatever that might be. Right?
Yep. So Daniel, I feel so remiss. We're almost out of time, but I have to have this next conversation with you.
Of course.
The thing about IoT is I now have connectivity to some hardware device someplace remote from where my central office is.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's data that can transfer to there. There's data that can transfer from there. What is it? Can you summarize the extra value that I could possibly achieve or the companies look for as they're trying to figure out, does IoT make sense for us to go implement?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it all goes down to what is the actual problem from the customer perspective. And one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in industrial types of applications is just lack of visibility on their processes. They need to optimize, but they don't know exactly how. So a lot of time, what IoT can give you is that visibility. And then you can actually leverage, let's say, machine learning or other tools to get some insights so that you can make decisions. And
so
that alone is very valuable, right?
To make sure I understand this, we're talking about the customer's visibility into their own process they didn't have,
Correct.
not the vendor's visibility into the customer's process.
Correct, exactly. And that's where data strategy comes into play, right? And I'm glad you asked that because there's a couple of ways that I think about data strategy. One is, how will you use data as a product company? How will you use the data that you acquire from your IoT systems to provide value to the customer, right? It's like this, either visibility or reports or predictive or whatever, right? But there's also, is there a data strategy that benefits your company per se? So for example, the whole goal of you deploying these systems is acquiring data, and then you're going to aggregate all that data and you're going to sell it to third parties, right? For example, there's companies that do that with smart meters, and then they aggregate all that data and sell it to utilities because they don't have access to that data, right? So those are two different things. So it's really important to understand the reason you are using this tool, IoT, is to collect data from the real world to provide insights and then monetize those insights, either directly to your customer or to sell it through APIs or to third parties or as reports, right? So that having that strategy of how you're going to leverage that data is extremely important, because the value that you can assign and ultimately the price that you can charge is going to depend on the perceived value of your customer on those insights out of the data. Nothing else matters.
Daniel, I could talk to you for another 3 hours, but we are out of time.
This has been a fantastic conversation, Mark. Thank you so much.
So I have to end with this question, though. What's one piece of pricing advice that you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
I think the one that I would give out is experiment with business models, because building these solutions and going to market is expensive and it's hard. So as much as you can, put your hypotheses on paper early and test them out with your potential market to see if there is traction, if your solution is viable, desirable, and feasible, and iterate. Right? Don't just think that you have the answer internally in your company and go build this thing and then face that nobody wanted it. So test out your business models, your value proposition, your pricing proposition, and your willingness to pay very, very early on and often.
That was a brilliant suggestion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And Daniel, thanks for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the best way to see what the work we're doing is go to ericsson.com/IoT Studio. And that's the website of my team. And you can see all the amazing things that we're doing with IoT and 5G and how we're leveraging this and how we work in the IoT Studio. And there's a way to contact us there.
Excellent. Episode 68 is all done. My favorite part of today's podcast was everything, but in particular, talking about the business models. To our listeners, what was your favorite part? Let us know in the comments of wherever you downloaded and listened. While you're at it, would you please leave us a 5-star review? These are very valuable to us. Don't forget, we have a free community where you can download all of the content that I create. That's at community.championsofvalue.com. If you have any questions or comments about the podcast or about pricing in general, feel free to email me, mark@impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.